Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you all again this morning. And this morning I want to talk about growth, economic growth. And I want to dive straight in. 3 facts, simple but really remarkable, have defined the economic history of human beings until now. The first is that for most of the 300,000 years that human beings have been around, economic life was essentially stagnant. So whether you were a hunter-gatherer laboring away in the Stone Age or somebody working at the start of the Industrial Revolution, although your lives would have differed in lots of different respects, fundamentally, from an economic point of view, it would have looked remarkably similar, an unforgiving, relentless struggle for subsistence. The second remarkable economic fact is that this stagnation only very recently came to an end. Modern economic growth began just 200, 300 years ago. And the third fact is that somehow we have managed to maintain this economic ascent. Now, as time has passed, we've used this extraordinary material prosperity to achieve remarkable outcomes, freeing billions from the struggle for subsistence that haunted our ancestors, making the average human life far longer, far healthier than ever before, funding discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the world, splitting the atom, cracking the genetic code, starting to explore the stars. But this pursuit of prosperity has also come at an enormous price: the destruction of the natural environment, the desolation of particular local places and communities, the emergence of vast inequalities between those who have a share in this prosperity and those who do not, the creation of new technologies like AI that have disruptive effects on work and on politics it's not clear yet we can properly control. And so growth presents us with a dilemma. On the one hand, it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing, but on the other hand, it's also associated with many of the greatest challenges that we face today as well. It feels like we're being pulled in 2 opposite directions at the same time. And this is what I want to explore with you this morning. The first is I want to share a few insights on the surprisingly recent history of the idea of economic growth. My starting point is going to be that we desperately need more economic growth, and I want to set out the importance of discovering new ideas in driving economic growth. But if we were to simply plow on in pursuit of more growth alone, we would be making the same mistake as those that came before, focusing too much on the promise of growth, ignoring the tremendous price. And so I also want to explore some thoughts on how we might pursue a different type of growth. And then I want to close by raising the question, what do we do if we cannot, particularly in the short run, change the nature of growth, where we face a tension between the pursuit of growth and other things that we might value and care about in society? So that's the plan, and I want to begin, as I said, with the history. Now, one of the things I find really interesting is that although today economic growth sits at the center of our common lives, what is fascinating is that before the 1950s, almost no politicians, policymakers, economists, business leaders, anyone was talking about the idea of economic growth. And that's what this Google Ngram shows. There's almost no mention of the phrase economic growth in print publications before 1950. And that only really changes, and the key point here is that even if policymakers and politicians had decided they wanted to pursue economic growth, they wouldn't have been able to. Until the 1950s, there was no reliable way of measuring how large the economy was, whether it was growing, and if so, by how much. And that only changes in World War II. So a basic question when you're waging war is how much of the economy can you slice up and dedicate to the war effort, and how much needs to be kept behind for civilian needs. And when policymakers in Britain faced this question, they couldn't answer it. There was no way of knowing how large the economy was. And so in stepped this man, the great British economist, John Maynard Keynes, to develop what would become known in the 1990s, along with Simon Kuznets in the US, the measure gross domestic product, or GDP. But GDP doesn't explain where growth comes from. The creation of GDP doesn't explain where growth comes from. GDP is just a static snapshot, of course, of how large the economy is at any particular moment in time. But growth is about relentlessly pursuing increases in GDP. So how did that become such a priority? Well, the answer to that is war again, albeit war of a different type. So when the Second World War comes to an end and the Cold War begins, none of the traditional measures of who's winning the war are useful. Things like territory won and lost, soldiers killed, weapons destroyed. None of that tells you who's winning in the battle between the US and the Soviet Union. And what becomes particularly important, particularly useful for seeing or for telling who's winning in that conflict is a very different measure, an economic measure, which is which economy is growing faster, the US or the Soviet Union. You get this remarkable period of growthmanship that begins with the Cold War. So you have President Kennedy, for instance, in the 1960s talking about how growth would be the thing that helps those sitting, quote, on the razor edge of decision fall on the side of capitalism. Then you have Khrushchev saying in response that growth is the battering ram with which they would smash the capitalist system. So it's war, first hot war, then Cold War, that puts growth on the map for the first time. But what happens is that as the 20th century unfolds and the demands of war fall away, it turns out that growth is associated with almost every measure, again, of human flourishing. Societies that grow more have populations that live longer, healthier lives. It creates more jobs. It's able to fund a more generous welfare system. And so as the demands of war fall away, growth sort of stubbornly remains behind as a policy priority. So it gets to its sort of pole policy-making position almost by accident. And as I said, my starting point in thinking about growth and this growth dilemma, this tension between the promise and the price of growth, is that we desperately need more growth. If growth were to fizzle out, it would just be a catastrophe. And so a natural question then is, well, how do we get more growth? Where does growth come from? And I think, again, one of the really interesting things is that although today politicians and policymakers talk very confidently about the idea of growth, we actually know surprisingly little about those causes. It remains one of the great mysteries of economic thought. Despite all the intellectual effort that's gone into trying to understand the causes of growth, there is a huge amount of debate and disagreement and uncertainty. That said, I do think there is one really important lesson for thinking about the causes of growth that we can draw out from this fog of uncertainty. And it's this, which is that if we want more growth, that growth has to come from technological progress. And if we want technological progress, what we need to do is to discover ever more ideas about the world, ever more creative, inventive, innovative, ingenious ideas. Now, this story that growth comes from technological progress and technological progress comes from more ideas matters, it seems to me, for three big reasons. The first reason is that I think it can help us correct some popular misunderstandings about the causes of growth. So it's very common, for instance, if you spend time in the environmental movement today, to hear something along the lines of this, that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. It's become something of a kind of rallying cry for the environmental movement. But this is in fact wrong. Infinite growth is possible on a finite planet. And the reason why it's possible, the reason why the environmental movement often makes this mistake, is because they are relying on a very old-fashioned view of economic activity. A view that's kind of better suited to the kind of 18th or 19th century, when when economies in this part of the world were tended to be made up of farms and factories. A material world where things could, inputs into production and outputs from production could be readily counted. And it's true, in this sort of world, there are obvious limits, physical limits on human activity, on economic activity. There's only so much land that can be farmed. There's only so much raw material for production. But this view that, we live on a finite physical planet, but this view of where growth comes from distracts us from how growth actually works. Again, growth doesn't come, and this is so important, from using ever more resources, more land, more raw materials, and so on. Growth comes by discovering ever more productive ways of using the resources that we have. In other words, growth comes again from technological progress. So another way to think about this is that growth doesn't come from the tangible world of objects, the things we can see and touch and drop on our feet, but growth comes from the intangible world of ideas. So what do I mean by ideas? Well, I mean recipes or instructions for organizing the atoms in the world, or more prosaically, recipes or instructions for making more productive use of the resources that we have. And the key point here is that whereas the planet of tangible physical resources might be finite, the universe of those intangible ideas is unimaginably vast. For all intents and purposes, as good as infinite. So just one way to hammer this point home. If you take a kitchen larder, and imagine it's a well-stocked larder, so there are 300 ingredients in this larder. There are finite ingredients in this larder, but there are more possible recipes for combining these ingredients than there are atoms in the universe. And the same principle applies when we're thinking about growth in an economy, where we're dealing not just with 300 ingredients in a larder, but quite literally all of the atoms in the universe. A second reason that this story, that growth comes from technological progress and technological progress comes from more ideas, a second reason this is really important is because it gives us a better sense of the levers that we can pull to get more growth. There is often a sense among politicians and policymakers around the world that growth comes from doing big, impressive things in the material world. Building more houses, building faster trains, building wider roads. That stuff's not going to harm growth, but if you really want to get more serious economic growth in GDP per capita, the question is, how do you generate ever more creative, new, inventive ideas about the world? How do you get more technological progress? And I think the answer to that question are four very different areas of policy. Thinking about intellectual property, how we own, the rules and regulations that shape who owns and controls ideas in society. Investing in research and development. We can't expect a steady stream of new ideas about the world unless we invest in their discovery. Getting more people into the parts of the economy which are responsible for generating more ideas. And finally, and perhaps most radically, using the technologies that we're developing today to help us generate new ideas themselves. So let me just pull out a couple of these just to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. Research and development. Here is research and development expenditure as a percentage of GDP in various countries around the world. At the top, you have Israel, which invests about 5.5% of GDP in R&D every year. The USA, about 2% behind. The OECD, on average, less than 3%. And then at the tail, you have lots of European countries, Ireland, for instance, but others as well. Britain just slightly ahead. The point I would make here is that you cannot expect a steady stream of new ideas about the world unless we collectively invest seriously in their discovery. That's one point I want to make. The other one I want to make is thinking about these technologies themselves. And this is, I think, the most provocative, but also in a way the most most sort of profound change that's happening at the moment in the world we live in. I think in the 20th century, the best ideas we had about the world came from the heads of smart human beings. And a country's prosperity depended upon its collective willingness to invest in human capital, the skills and capabilities of its workforce. I wonder if in the 21st century, the best ideas we have about the world are going to come increasingly from these technologies that we're building instead, and a country's prosperity is going to depend far more on its willingness to invest in those technologies instead. So just to give you a flavor of what it is that I'm talking about here, we sort of caught a glimpse of what technology-based idea discovery could look like during the pandemic. Moderna, famously using AI to help them generate the design for their COVID vaccine. And now the field of AI-enabled drug discovery is pretty widespread. The most interesting to me and the most again, sort of kind of provocative example of this is what happened with AlphaFold in the last few years. So AlphaFold is a system designed by DeepMind, an artificial intelligence company owned by Google. And a few years ago, they solved the so-called protein folding problem. So just in short, the natural world is full of millions of proteins. And if we want to understand how disease works and be able to treat disease, we need to know what the 3D shape of proteins is. But figuring out the 3D shape of proteins is incredibly difficult. It would take an average PhD student in biology, it said, their entire PhD to figure out the shape of just one protein. And we knew until recently about 10 to 15% of the 3D shapes. And yet what AlphaFold did was that it stepped forward, and essentially it's a system that has solved the protein folding problem. It has calculated the 3D shape of every protein, and they've made it available open source. And it's going to transform, it already is, our understanding of disease and how we treat them. What's interesting is that last year, Daniel Susskind, the co-founder of DeepMind, the company responsible for building this system, won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. This is a system that has generated extraordinarily profound ideas about the world. And I think this is a glimpse of what we're going to see far more of in years and decades to come. These extraordinarily capable systems themselves helping us better understand the world, generate new ideas about the world. The third reason I think this story matters is that it matters particularly for Europe. And thinking about this, why is it, so I've said the US versus the UK, it should be the US versus the EU. Why is it that the gap between the EU and the US has widened from 17% in 2002 to 30% in 2023 in terms of GDP? Why is that? I think the best insight was buried away in the Draghi report, with which you will all be familiar. And just quoting here, if we exclude the tech sector, EU productivity growth over the past 20 years would be broadly at par with the United States. The reason the US has grown so much faster than the EU over the last few decades is not because the US has built more trains, has a better train network. Anyone who's taken a ride on Amtrak will know that that is obviously not the case. The reason the US has soared relative to the EU is because it has this technology sector, this extraordinary cauldron of ideas, of innovation, of creativity that the EU does not have. In fact, if the EU were to have grown, were to have closed that gap with the US over the last couple of decades, on average, it's thought that real wages in the EU would be $8,500 higher if that gap had closed over the last few decades. So I think there are various reasons why being clear about this idea that growth comes from technological progress and technological progress comes from new ideas matters so much for thinking about how we get more growth. But the point I would want to make is that if we simply plow on in pursuit of more growth, we would be ignoring the tremendous price of growth as well. And so what we've got to do, it seems to me, is ask the question, how can we pursue a different type of growth? And to catch one example of what it would mean to pursue a different type of growth, I want to focus on one dimension of the price of growth, which is the most traditional one, which is that we are, in some sense, growing towards a kind of climate catastrophe, the climate impact of economic growth. And I want to take you back to 2007, when the first report of its kind into the economics of climate change was written by Sir Nicholas Stern. And one of the central conclusions of this report in 2007 was that if we wanted to reduce emissions by 80%, it would cost us 1% of GDP per year. In other words, there was a trade-off between growth and the climate. We had to pay a serious price in terms of growth in order to protect the climate. The year after 2008, Nicholas Stern came forward and said, no, I got it wrong. Climate change is worse than I thought. It's actually going to cost us 2% of GDP per year to reduce emissions by 80%. The trade-off between growth and the climate had got worse. Fast forward, though, to the year 2020, and look at the work of the UK Climate Change Committee, which is just a sort of representative example of a body at the time advising the government on how to respond to climate change, they concluded that to completely eliminate emissions, so not simply reduce them by 80%, but to completely eliminate them, would cost just 0.5% of GDP per year. In other words, the trade-off between growth and the climate had dramatically improved. Today, we need to pay a far lower price in terms of growth in order to protect the climate. And the big question is why? What has happened over the last few decades that means we are able to grow while at the same time causing far less damage to the environment, while protecting this other thing that we care about? And the answer is essentially that a couple of decades of changes in taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, social norms, have completely transformed the incentives that people face in society. So people are incentivized not only to develop new technologies, and again, that's what drives economic growth in my argument, but also to develop a particular type of technology, namely those that allow us to grow while also causing less damage to the environment. In short, we've had not simply a technological revolution, but a green technological revolution. And I think the best example of this is what's happened with solar energy over the last few decades. So if you go back to the 1970s, solar energy really is a tool of last resort if you want to generate electricity in outer space or in an isolated lighthouse. But what we've seen over the last few decades is a precipitous, an exponential fall in the cost of generating electricity via solar from about, I think it's $100 per watt back in the 1970s to about $0.50 per watt today. And we've seen as well an explosive uptake in the use of solar panels as well. We see them all over the place. What has driven this is technological progress, a particular type of technological progress. And what it's meant in practice is that more and more countries around the world are able to grow the top line in each of those boxes while reducing emissions in absolute terms at the same time, the bottom line there, in a way that was just simply inconceivable a few decades ago. So the point I would make is that we should not underestimate the power of incentives to shape the type or the direction of technological progress that takes place in society. And the argument that I make is that we ought to be trying to do this not simply with respect to the climate, but we ought to be trying to change those incentives to promote technological progress that not only makes us more prosperous, but also doesn't widen inequalities in society, that doesn't undermine the availability of good work, that doesn't challenge how well our politics functions, and doesn't disrupt the health of local places and communities. And what I try and do in my work is show how we might do each of those things in turn. I think one kind of quite powerful way of thinking about this is the following, which is when many people talk about growth, often the metaphor they have in mind is that we are, as societies, almost sitting in a kind of train cabin. And the choice that we have is whether to kind of push forward on the lever and go faster and get more technological progress and more growth, or pull back and go slower and get less technological progress and less growth. But the basic idea is that our kind of direction of travel is fixed. That we've just, the only choice is between more and less growth. And we've just got to trundle along in the direction that's been set for us. And I think this is the wrong metaphor. I think a far better metaphor for us is a sort of nautical one. We're out there in a boat bobbing away at sea, and we can pull up our sails and go faster, or we can pull them down and go slower. But we also have a huge amount of discretion collectively over our direction of travel, over the sorts of technologies, the type of technologies that we develop in society, and the nature of economic growth that we enjoy as a result. So that's what I think we ought to be trying to do, to try and pursue growth while also at the same time pursuing growth by not challenging these other things that we might value and care about. But I think the really difficult, the big challenge that we face in the short run is that might not always be possible, that it might not be possible to weaken the trade-off between growth and these other things that we care about. And so, the final question that we face, and it's perhaps the most difficult one of all, is what do we choose to do? Do we want to pursue growth, or do we want to protect these other ends that we care about? And you see this tension time and again. And I think there is a view today that the way to respond to this tension between growth and these other things that we care about is to play around with the GDP measure. To say that, look, there are things out there that we think are valuable and important, the state of the environment, the level of inequality in society, and what we ought to do is we ought to come up with measures of those things and bundle them into GDP and kind of make a more perfect GDP measure, a sort of GDP plus. And I think that is a big mistake. And the reason I think it's a mistake is because these questions about what else we ought to value, if not growth, and how much we ought to value them, these are not technical questions about mismeasurement, but they are moral questions about what matters. They are some of the hardest, most difficult questions that we can ask, and there's a huge amount of moral disagreement about them. And what that means is that the place for resolving these questions, in my view, about what we ought to care about, if not growth, and how much we ought to care about them, it's not for economists like me to answer those questions. It's not for social scientists, but it's for citizens. The place for answering them is not economics, but it's politics. And so one of the things that I think is really important at the moment is that we encourage the development of new political institutions that are capable of hosting debate and disagreement among citizens about these trade-offs between growth and these other things that we care about. And I take a lot of encouragement from the rise of so-called mini-publics across Europe and elsewhere over the last few years. I think we need to see far more of this when we're thinking about growth and the tension between growth and other things that we care about. Again, these are questions not for economists and social scientists, but in my view, they are questions for citizens to be answering. So let me just close. I closed last night on a note of optimism, and I want to close on another note of optimism because, and it's a related one, but we live in an age of anxiety where almost every day we are reminded of the sort of existential challenges that we face and our supposed incapacity for dealing with them. But the argument that I hope I've made this morning is a far more optimistic one. That we, in a sense, also have an existential opportunity in front of us as well. We are looking out into the future far more collectively prosperous and technologically capable than any point in human history. We have this interesting moment, a kind of moral moment, an opportunity to pay far more attention to these other ends that, in my view, we've tended to neglect until now. And we can, as I said, do so from this position of economic and technological strength. There is a line that I love from the great late philosopher Derek Parfit when he said, "We have the power not just to make life good in decades to come, but to make it better in ways that we now cannot even imagine." Nothing in my view could be more important than that, and that, I think, engaging with that is the great challenge for all of us at the moment. So I will finish there. Thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward now to taking some questions and hearing some reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Again, another provocative introduction to our discussions for today. Daniel also addressed us last night, for those of you who were not with us yesterday evening. I'm sorry you weren't. And it left several questions. And I know that already I have spoken to colleagues this morning who are saying, well, I'd like to take him up on that.
Yeah.
So, and I know Daniel is ready to be taken up on many of the issues here that he has raised today. I also just want to draw attention to the fact that you're all very welcome, and it's just wonderful to see so many of you here this morning. I would also just like to remind you that we are also being followed on web stream. So hello to our audience who are out there, colleagues out in Eurofound, not least, but also across Europe. So you're also very welcome. So Daniel, there are greater minds in this room than mine, certainly, when it comes to all things economics, and I am sure they have questions that will ask you about GDP in great detail. I am interested in the values.
Yes.
I am interested in the moral questions
Yes.
that you raise. And when you talk about that there can be infinite growth in a finite planet,
Yes.
I disagree with you,
Yeah.
but I'm not going to do that ad nauseum. But I do wonder, does there not come a point where the trade-off is one trade-off too far? And that decision has to be based on values.
Yeah.
And seeing as today's discussion is very much about the European social model, and the European social model differentiates us from the other trading blocs. So if we're going to be more competitive against those that don't have a European social model, it's about values. And so my question to you really would be, is it not too easy to say, well, that's for the citizens to decide in assemblies and all of the rest? Is it not more about saying, is the European social model not, in fact, Europe's moral compass?
Yeah. So various responses. I mean, one is, one of the things I'm trying to argue is that often the trade-offs, often the trade-offs are illusory. That there are ways for us to pursue growth while also protecting lots of other things that we think are valuable and important. And I think, for instance, and I do think the environmental story, although the way in which people talk about the environment today is that it's an utter catastrophe, but I think there's another telling of the story over the last few decades, which is that actually it's an extraordinary accomplishment that we have been able to develop these technologies that now allow our economies to grow while also causing just far less damage to the environment relative to what was thought a few decades ago. And I think that basic insight that there are ways for us to pursue different types of growth, we don't always have to choose between them, is really important. But I completely agree that, particularly in the short run, there are often tensions between the pursuit of growth and the protection of these other things that are valuable and important. And I agree with you with the observation that these questions are not technical ones, but they are moral ones. They are not questions about what is, but they are questions about what ought to be. And my view is that these moral questions, the place for engaging with them is politics. And it's not politics, in my view, traditionally understood, great chambers of state and traditional politicians, but it's individual citizens coming together to debate and discuss these issues. One of the big worries I have about at the moment is that these trade-offs between growth and other things that people might care about are being made without the input of citizens, and as a result, they are lacking legitimacy. I worry, for instance, there are lots of people who feel that the pursuit of net zero or environmental objectives, given the economic costs that are involved, that there are people who feel disenfranchised and disengaged from that not technical decision, but moral one about whether we are going to prioritize in the short run the pursuit of prosperity or the protection of the environment. I have my own views on whether or not we're resolving that trade-off adequately, but I also know that many people out there do. And one of my worries, big worries, is that unless we engage people in how we resolve these trade-offs, the way in which we resolve them as a society is going to, and is already lacking, in some cases, legitimacy. And that's a big concern for me. So I'm with you all the way up until the thought that simply recognizing that these are moral issues is sufficient. That once you recognize that these are moral issues about what really matters, we have to make sure that we are debating and disagreeing and discussing them as a society, as citizens. So that that we can reach a kind of balanced dissatisfaction in society where everyone feels that even if the path we're taking doesn't necessarily reflect their own personal views, they feel like they have taken part in a debate, a discussion to shape that direction.
But I suppose many of those issues as well, which are moral issues and that you say should be dealt with in the political arena, they're not separate from the economic arena because, as Ivailo mentioned earlier, I mean, much work has been done, not only by Eurofund, but by many others, on the economic cost
Yes.
that there is about not integrating these moral issues
Yeah.
into our societies and indeed perhaps our GDP. And the talk about going beyond GDP, I recognise
Yes.
that you don't, but perhaps that is also something that we could look at, and we certainly will look at in the sessions later. But I'm not going to, because we have gone a little bit over time, so I'm not going to dwell too much here. I know we have questions in the audience, and I'd like to go to the floor straight away. Bear with me. We will have the minister arriving. Yes, now. So I'm going to go to the floor, and please, Pilvi. If you could just introduce yourself.
Yes, please. Yeah, it'd be really helpful for me to know.
Yeah, there should be microphones in the room here. Can we give a microphone to the lady here with the yellow jacket?
Thanks a lot. Pilvi Torsti, director of a new agency, European Training Foundation, working on the human capital development, mainly outside Europe. In my past, I've also worked as a researcher and in education, field of education, as a decision-maker in my native Finland. My question is a combination from your yesterday's and today's talk and the role of education, which of course we all also ask now with the AI, that what is actually the role of the education systems? And you showed, of course, the convincing data about the a one-to-one tuition and what that really means for the learning outcomes. But of course, education is actually a building block of a democratic society. And for instance, for the citizens that are able to take part in the votes that were just presented here as a kind of solution. So I would probably challenge a little bit yesterday's talk about the role of education as simply path for knowledge, but rather actually a building block of a society, and also more and more actually having demand to develop sort of socio-emotional skills that are not exactly measured in one-on-one tutoring, whether human or AI, and would be interested in your comments on that. Thank you.
Daniel, I'm going to just take one or two more just so that we're efficient on this. Can I see, is anyone else in the room looking for a question now? This lady here, beside Pilvi here. If you could also introduce yourself also, thank you.
Hello, I'm also from the same institution, European Training Foundation, a labor market expert. I was just reflecting, and I would like to really hear your feeling about well, you left the biggest responsibility to the citizens in this puzzle, in my opinion, and to the politicians. But you left the biggest responsibility to deal with all these values and everything. Yes. Of course, it's for citizens and politicians, obviously. What else could it be? But are citizens ready to take up this responsibility, or the current political systems, how they go, erosion of the democracy, whatever it is limited, however limited it is, by the way. I mean, we are talking about a handful of countries anyway. Thinking about also the impact of algorithms on polarization, social polarization and everything, I am not sure that the politicians and citizens are up to the challenge. And this is, easy to say, but almost impossible to do, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Within this puzzle, one more thing, how do developing countries fit into this puzzle, moreover?
Okay. And one more there, Jerzy, our chairman of the management board.
Thank you. As usual, very interesting. I just have two questions which kind of follow this discussion about not economic only aspects, but also moral aspects. So my first question would be, because you have said something very intriguing, that growth ultimately depends on new ideas. And that then you said also that the amazingly good ideas could be developed by those new technologies, AI, for instance. So my question to you is, what if AI tells us that the best way to development is the Chinese way? That in other words, living in a concentration camp where everybody will be well fed and well clad. So what do we do with this? How do we, kind of if the question of growth would be, you know, this is the criterion, then how do you moderate it with other values, and then what would be the effect on competitiveness? Because ultimately, you know, we have to win the competition. The second question is, you know, how the mini publics that we need to be. I reject this idea that the public is not mature enough and therefore they need to be told, you know, what to do, because that's ultimately anti-democratic in my view. But how do you engage the Chinese and the Indians in that discussion? Because ultimately the discussion about the model of growth will be decided there, not in the shrinking in terms of population Western countries. Thank you.
Great. Let me start with the first question about the role of education. I mean, I agree with you that, you know, traditionally, you know, since the sort of 1950s, 60s, essentially in the second half of the 20th century, the conception of the role of education changes, and it does become more of a kind of, you say, instrumentalist, a means to an end, a means to get the right skills and capabilities to flourish in the workplace. And lots of, you know, kind of philosophy of education narrows down quite a lot. It's not like that at the start of the 20th century, and it's certainly not like that at other moments in human history. I think one of the challenges from some of those ideas I shared yesterday about, you know, what is the role of education in a world where, you know, in that sort of, you know, scenario where there might not be enough work for everybody to do. That forces you to engage with these questions about what the role of education is. And it's, you know, it's very obvious that one of the answers to that is that, well, education isn't simply a means to an end, but it's also, and it, you know, it has an important kind of civic and, you know, democratic role. So I agree with you on that. I think that role is important now. And I think it becomes increasingly important if you take seriously some of these ideas about where these technologies might be taking us. On the question about whether or not citizens are up for it, I mean, and you said something along the lines of, you know, what else might we do? You know, the truth is that at the moment we don't really engage citizens. You know, and the sort of the challenge I would make is that the conventional wisdom that the way to resolve some of these trade-offs and, you know, moral trade-offs, not technical ones, is through getting our measurement right. These efforts to kind of improve the GDP measure. Those seem to me to be good examples of our current strategy, which is smuggling away these difficult moral questions about what do we really value and how much ought we to value them. You know, should the environment be in that GDP measure, the GDP plus measure? Many people have a strong view on that, but that's not a technical view. That's a moral view. How much do you, you know, what weight do you put on that environmental variable in this, you know, GDP plus function? That question about what that weight ought to be with respect to the environment relative to, say, inequality in society, that is a moral question, not a technical one. And at the moment, there are very few places in the world where these conversations about, you know, what we ought to value and if not, how much ought we to value them, where those are, you know, engaged with by citizens rather than by people like me, technocrats, economists, statisticians. So, you know, there is a response that we have at the moment, you know, and I think it's the wrong direction of travel. And I know I'm sort of swinging against a current. I know that, you know, all around the world the view is that, you know, this is a mistake. But I think we're making a mistake. On the on this question about two questions. One about you know, how should we handle the outputs of these AI systems? You know, one of the arguments of my work at the moment is that it's not simply enough to, you know, what we have to do in thinking about how we prepare the next generation to use these technologies is it's not simply enough to teach people how to use them, but we have to teach them how to use them critically. You know, these systems are not like calculators. They make mistakes. They have limitations. They have weaknesses. They hallucinate. You know, there are lots of, and a big challenge for us in drawing up this new curriculum for our society and thinking about how we engage with this technology and use it effectively is to teach citizens how to use it critically, to not use it blindly, to not take things as, both for technical reasons, because answers just might be wrong, it might just get a bit of reasoning or a bit of mathematics wrong, but also exactly as you say, for moral reasons. It might be taking normative positions on issues, these systems that we as individuals, as a society, feel uncomfortable with. So I think one of our big challenges is teaching people how to use them critically, not simply use them blindly. Whereas at the moment, I think too many people are being taught to use these things blindly. On this question about China and India, I mean, this is a far bigger question about how we, about how the world order works in this setting where we have, countries with very different kind of institutional and political setups, and I think it's, it is far bigger than simply this issue. It's a kind of political question about how you shape, influence, direct the kind of institutions in these countries, or, as you say, kind of win the battle, the race, the competition with those institutions. But it would be a non-starter for me to go to China and say the way to respond to climate change here is to engage in kind of citizens' assemblies, and it's just completely antithetical to their sort of political and philosophical culture. So I am, in making these calls, very much, as you're sort of picking up on, operating in a thinking about the kind of the democratic institutions that we have in our part of the world.
Actually, I'm just going to go for one more short question, very short question. Salvatore.
Thank you. From Italy, the workers group of the Eurofound. I particularly appreciated your note of optimism. It's very much needed these days. At the same time, you invited us to look for more citizens' participation. Trade unions around the world represent directly the voice of workers. So there's no better way of participating in engaging in a trade union these days to have your voice heard. At the same time, when you say we have to involve our people and make their voice heard, I find it extremely difficult these days for this to happen. So I'm very thankful for your optimism, but I'm also pessimistic about this because I see that even in Europe,
yes,
in Western countries, there is really a big hurdle we're facing at the moment in having people participating because there is a shrinking civic space and civil liberties are severely under attack even in Western countries. So you invite us to make people and citizens and workers, I say, using my language, participate, but I see that our space is really shrinking in a time when the far right, extremist movements are on the rise. So what do you see? I mean, are you as pessimistic as I am, or do you see a way out of this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I find the trends you describe alarming, and they run, and it's what, trying to reverse those trends is, part of the sort of the project that I think is important at the moment. I mean, one observation I would make is that, I spoke last night about how when thinking about education, it's not simply enough to ask the question, what are we teaching people, but we also need to ask, how are we teaching? That the way in which we educate needs to change. One of the things I find quite striking about, organized labor around the world is how little those organizations themselves have changed how they work. This is a challenge that I would put to many unions and many organizations, that they are the way in which they operate, the way in which they organize, the way in which they make their voice heard. It's all it too is very old-fashioned, and I sometimes I do wonder if one of the reasons that union membership is on the decline among young people, for instance, is that these institutions don't reflect the way that although they are perhaps working for ends that are aligned with their own, the institutions themselves don't look like, it doesn't feel like they are the sort of institution that represents them in terms of how they operate, the technologies they use, the way in which they move in the world. I think it's a really interesting challenge for unions, for organized movements around the world to ask, how can we use these technologies as well to transform how we work, and could we use these technologies to encourage wider membership? So I think there's this question, how can unions be sort of 21st century rather than 20th century unions? I think is quite an interesting sort of exam question. But I agree with your observation, which is that this trend is not a good one, and it's one that I'm wanting to push against and try and reverse in calling for greater political, deliberative participation in these questions.
Okay, well, we have the arrival of the Taoiseach in the building, so I am going to ask those of you who still have questions in mind to keep them with you for the breakout sessions, which will follow shortly. We have the 3 breakout sessions, which will allow us to delve into some of the issues which you've heard about today, quality of jobs, AI, and also, of course, social investment. So there's no risk that you will not be able to discuss the issues that you've heard today. Daniel will be around for a little while, so you'll be able to dip in and out if you wish to speak with him. And I would ask you all to put your hands together again to thank Daniel very much for his presentation and contribution. Okay.